The rain poured in relentless sheets, drenching the city in a cold, unforgiving darkness. Inside a dimly lit cafe, Ava Sinclair sat clutching a cup of coffee, her hands trembling as she stared at the stack of unpaid bills in front of her. The weight of her family's struggles pressed heavily on her chest. Her father's medical bills, her younger brother's tuition, the eviction notice looming over their heads. She had tried everything, working extra shifts, cutting back on expenses, even swallowing her pride to ask for loans. But nothing had been enough. And now, the only option left was the one that made her stomach twist in knots. "Are you certain about this?" her best friend, Mia, asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ava exhaled shakily. "I don't have a choice." Before Mia could say another word, the bell above the cafe door chimed. The air seemed to shift, growing heavier with the arrival of the man who had just walked in. Damian Blackwood, the billionaire tycoon, known for his ruthless business tactics and his cold, emotionless demeanor, stood tall in his tailored black suit. His icy gray eyes scanned the room until they landed on her. Ava forced herself to hold his gaze, even as every instinct told her to run. He strode toward her with the confidence of a man who owned everything, including the outcome of this conversation. "Ava," he said smoothly, his voice deep and commanding. She swallowed hard. "Mr. Blackwood, you know why I'm here." He took the seat across from her, his gaze unwavering. "Have you made your decision?" Ava's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. She had spent the last week agonizing over it, weighing every possible consequence. But in the end, her family's survival mattered more than her pride. She inhaled deeply before meeting his gaze. "I'll do it." For the first time, something flickered in Damian's eyes, satisfaction. "Good," he said, leaning back in his chair. "We'll be married by the end of the week." Her heart pounded. There was no turning back now. She had just agreed to marry a man who had no love to give. And in 1 year, she would walk away. Or so she thought. The next morning, Ava found herself standing in the towering Blackwood Enterprises building, her fingers tightening around the strap of her worn-out handbag. The pristine marble floors, the gleaming glass walls, and the scent of expensive cologne reminded her that she did not belong in this world. She took a steadying breath and approached the receptionist, who barely spared her a glance before directing her to the top floor. As the elevator doors slid shut, her reflection stared back at her. Wide brown eyes filled with uncertainty, lips pressed together to suppress the fear clawing at her throat. What had she done? Before she could dwell on it, the elevator chimed, and the doors opened to a sprawling office with floor-to-ceiling windows. The man himself sat behind a sleek black desk, flipping through a document. Damian Blackwood barely acknowledged her as she stepped inside. "Sit," he commanded without looking up. Ava forced herself to move forward, perching stiffly on the leather chair across from him. The silence stretched between them like a knife's edge until he finally set the papers down and pinned her with his piercing gray eyes. "The contract," he said, sliding a thick document toward her. She hesitated before reaching for it, her pulse racing as she skimmed the words. It was detailed, meticulous, cold, just like the man sitting before her. Marriage duration 1 year. No intimacy unless mutually agreed upon. Public appearances required as necessary. Absolute discretion. Breach of contract results in legal action. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't a marriage. It was a transaction, a business deal wrapped in the illusion of vows. Damian watched her, his expression unreadable. "If you have objections, now is the time." Ava clenched her hands in her lap. Did she have a choice? Her father's life depended on this. She swallowed the lump in her throat and picked up the pen. "I'll sign," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Damian's lips curved slightly, not a smile, but something close to satisfaction. "Good. Our wedding is in 3 days." Her breath hitched. "That's soon." "I don't waste time, Ava." "Neither should you." With that, he stood, walking around the desk until he was towering over her. His presence was overpowering, his scent, dark cedarwood and expensive leather, filling her senses. "You made your choice," he murmured. "And now you belong to me." A shiver ran down her spine. She had just sealed her fate. 3 days passed in a blur. The media had caught wind of the whirlwind marriage, speculating about the unexpected union between the infamous billionaire and an unknown woman. Damian's PR team had spun a perfect story. A romance kept in secrecy, a love too precious to be shared until now. Ava knew better. Dressed in an elegant ivory gown, she stood in front of the full-length mirror, the weight of reality pressing down on her. The dress was exquisite, hand-sewn lace, pearl beading, the kind of gown every girl dreamed of. And yet, she felt nothing. No excitement. No joy. Only a suffocating emptiness. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. Mia peeked inside, her face a mix of worry and sadness. "Are you sure about this?" Ava forced a smile. "It's already done." Mia stepped inside, gripping her hands. "Ava, this isn't love. This is a cage." "I know," she whispered, "but it's a cage that saves my family." Mia exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "Just promise me one thing. When the year is up, you walk away. No matter what." Ava hesitated. Could she? She had to. "I promise," she lied. The ceremony was a grand affair, but it was nothing more than a spectacle. The venue was lavish, filled with people who didn't care about love. Only power, status, and the game of wealth. Damian stood at the altar, the embodiment of control, his face betraying nothing. As Ava walked down the aisle, her heart pounded. She barely knew this man, and yet in a few moments, she would be his wife. Damian reached for her hand, his fingers cool against hers. When the vows were spoken, they were empty words, scripted and practiced, devoid of emotion. And then came the kiss. A simple brush of lips. No warmth, no tenderness, just a silent agreement, a contract sealed before the world. The moment it ended, he leaned close, his breath tickling her ear. "Smile. Ava," he murmured. "You're Mrs. Blackwood now." She smiled. And with that, her life as a billionaire's wife began. The honeymoon suite was nothing short of breathtaking, a penthouse overlooking the city, adorned with flickering candlelight and soft orchestral music playing in the background. But to Ava, it felt more like a gilded cage. She stood in the middle of the massive bedroom, her hands clenched at her sides as Damian shrugged off his jacket, tossing it onto a chair. His movements were effortless, exuding the quiet dominance he always carried. "You can have the bedroom," he said, unbuttoning his cuffs. "I'll take the study." Ava blinked, caught off guard. "Wait, you're not staying here?" He shot her a glance, one eyebrow raised. "Did you think this was real?" He crept up her neck, but she refused to let him see how flustered she was. "I just thought. I don't know. Most newlyweds." "We are not most newlyweds, Ava." His voice was sharp, cutting through her sentence. "This marriage is a business arrangement. Nothing more." She swallowed the sting of his words.
Right.
She had known this from the beginning. Still, the way he said it, like she was just another deal, another number on a contract, made her stomach twist. She nodded stiffly. Understood. Without another word, Damian walked toward the door. But just as he reached it, he paused. "You're free to do what you want as long as it doesn't interfere with my life," he said coolly. "But remember this, Ava, you wear my name now. You play your role. And when the time comes, you walk away." His words settled deep in her chest, heavy and suffocating. And then he was gone. Ava sank onto the edge of the bed, staring at the glittering city lights outside the window. She had agreed to this. She had signed the contract, knowing exactly what it meant. But why did it already feel like she was losing something she never even had? Days turned into weeks, and Ava quickly learned that being Damian Blackwood's wife was not as simple as she had thought. She was expected to attend events, to smile for the cameras, to play the role of the perfect wife. Damian, ever the businessman, was calculated in his public affection, an arm around her waist, a gentle whisper in her ear, a press of his lips against her temple. To the world, they were the epitome of love. Behind closed doors, they were strangers. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood." Ava greeted as she entered the dining room one morning, forcing a polite smile. Damian barely looked up from his newspaper. "We're married, Ava. Try to act like it." Her fingers twitched around the coffee cup. "So, should I call you darling instead?" she quipped. A ghost of a smirk crossed his lips, but it vanished just as quickly. "If you must." She rolled her eyes, taking a seat across from him. "You really don't talk much, do you?" "I talk when necessary."
"Right."
"And I assume actual human conversation isn't necessary?" He folded his newspaper and met her gaze with those piercing gray eyes. "I prefer efficiency." "God, you sound like a corporate manual." He arched a brow. "Did you expect a love story, Ava?" She exhaled through her nose.
"No."
"But I didn't expect to feel like a business meeting either." For a moment, he just stared at her, as if trying to figure her out. Then, he leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Finish your breakfast. We have a gala tonight." And just like that, the conversation was over. Ava clenched her jaw as she stabbed at her toast. The year couldn't pass fast enough. The gala was a grand affair, filled with elite businessmen, socialites, and the kind of people who thrived on power and wealth. Ava stood by Damian's side, her hand resting lightly on his arm, smiling when necessary, nodding politely as he introduced her to people whose names she would forget by morning. But it wasn't until she stepped away to get some air that things shifted. She found herself on the balcony, the cool night breeze a welcome escape from the suffocating room inside. She closed her eyes, exhaling softly. "I see the wife of Damian Blackwood needs an escape," a smooth voice drawled behind her. Ava turned to see a man in a navy blue suit, his smirk lazy but sharp. She recognized him from earlier. Elliot Graves, another powerful businessman, though his reputation was more scandal than success. "I just needed some air," she replied carefully. Elliot stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with curiosity. "I have to admit, when I heard Damian Blackwood got married, I expected someone colder. Not this." Her spine stiffened. "This?" His smirk deepened. "You don't belong in his world." Ava's hands curled into fists. She was about to respond when a familiar voice cut through the tension. "I believe my wife and I were in the middle of a conversation." She turned to find Damian standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable, but his presence undeniable. Elliot chuckled, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Relax, Blackwood. Just making conversation." Damian didn't respond. Instead, he extended a hand toward Ava. "Inside. Now." Ava hesitated before placing her hand in his. As he led her back into the ballroom, his grip tightened just slightly, possessive, firm. Only when they were far from prying eyes did he release her. "You shouldn't talk to men like him," he said, his tone clipped. She bristled. "Excuse me? He's trouble. And you are my wife." Something in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. "For a year," she reminded him. "After that, it won't matter." For the briefest moment, something flashed in his eyes. Something dark, something unreadable. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. "Go home, Ava," he said coolly. "I'll be late." She stared at him for a long moment before turning away. She had agreed to this. She had told herself she wouldn't let him affect her. But as she walked away, her heart pounded with a dangerous realization. For a man who claimed he didn't care, Damian Blackwood had just acted like he did. Ava barely spoke to Damian for the next few days. She told herself it didn't matter. Their marriage was just a contract, an arrangement built on necessity, not emotion. But the moment on the balcony lingered in her mind. The way Damian had reacted, the subtle shift in his expression, the possessiveness in his voice. Why had he cared? She wasn't naive enough to think it was jealousy. No, Damian Blackwood was not a man ruled by emotions. And yet, there's something in his actions that unsettled her. It didn't help that she rarely saw him. He worked long hours, leaving early and coming home late. Some nights, she doubted he even came home at all. She should have been relieved. Less time together meant fewer opportunities for awkward silences and cold exchanges. But instead, she found herself staring at the clock, wondering when he would return. She hated herself for that. That evening, she sat alone in the grand dining room, staring at the untouched plate before her. The mansion was too quiet, too empty, making the loneliness settle deeper in her chest. She wasn't sure what compelled her to pick up her phone, but before she could talk herself out of it, she typed out a message. "Ava, are you coming home tonight?" She stared at the screen, debating whether to delete it. But before she could, 3 dots appeared. Then, "Damian, late meeting. Don't wait up." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She wanted to type something, to ask him why he even bothered coming home at all. Instead, she set her phone down and pushed her plate away, her appetite gone. She had signed up for this. She had agreed to a cold, distant marriage. So, why did it feel like it was getting harder to endure? A week passed before Ava saw Damian again. It was well past midnight when she heard the front door open. She had fallen asleep on the couch with a book in her lap, the soft glow of a lamp the only source of light. She blinked sleepily as Damian stepped inside, his suit jacket draped over his arm, his tie loosened. He looked exhausted. For a moment, he just stood there, his sharp gaze settling on her. "You're still awake?" She sat up, rubbing her eyes. "I fell asleep waiting." His expression flickered, but it was gone too quickly for her to read. He glanced at the clock. "It's late." "No kidding," she muttered. A silence stretched between them. She expected him to disappear into his study like he always did, but to her surprise, he stepped farther into the room, eyeing the book in her lap. "What are you reading?" Ava raised a brow. Was Damian Blackwood actually trying to make conversation? She held up the cover. Pride and Prejudice. A corner of his lips twitched. "A romance novel? Why? Do you have something against romance?" His gaze darkened, but there was something almost amused about it. "I don't believe in it." Ava exhaled through her nose. "Of course you don't." "Let me guess," he said, stepping closer. "You do?" She lifted her chin. "Yes, I do. Some people actually believe in love, Damian. Not everything has to be a business transaction." His jaw tightened. "Love is just an illusion. People fall for it the same way they fall for a beautifully packaged lie." Ava scoffed. "That's a very cynical way of looking at the world." "It's a realistic way of looking at the world." She shook her head, closing the book. "Maybe that's why you're always alone." The words hung between them, heavier than she intended. Something flickered in his expression, something unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned away and headed toward the stairs. Ava sighed, leaning back against the couch. Why did she even try? Days passed, and something between them had shifted. Damian still kept his distance, but there were moments, small, fleeting moments, where the cold mask cracked. Like the time she found him in his study late at night, staring out the window with a drink in hand. She had walked in without thinking, expecting him to send her away. Instead, he had simply looked at her, then poured her a glass as well. Or the time they were at a charity event, and a group of women had been whispering about Ava, questioning her worth, suggesting she had married him for money. She had forced herself to ignore them, but before she could turn away, Damian had placed a firm hand on her waist and leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. "Let them talk," he had murmured. "They'll never have what you do." It was an act, of course. A role he played perfectly. But for some reason, those words had made her heart skip a beat. And then there was the moment that changed everything. It was a stormy night when Ava woke to a loud crash. She sat up, her heart racing as thunder rumbled outside. The house was dark, the power flickering. She was about to settle back down when she heard something, movement from downstairs. Frowning, she grabbed a robe and stepped out of her room. She found Damian in the kitchen, his shirt undone at the collar, his sleeves rolled up. He was leaning over the counter, gripping the edge like he was trying to steady himself. "Damian?" she asked hesitantly. He didn't respond right away. "Then, go back to bed, Ava." His voice was rougher than usual, his posture tense. She stepped closer. "Are you okay?" A long silence. Then, finally, "No." The single word sent a shiver down her spine. She had never heard him sound vulnerable before. She hesitated before reaching out, placing a hand on his arm. Damian, what's wrong? He didn't pull away. For a moment, it was just the sound of the storm outside, the silence stretching between them. Then, finally, he turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting hers. Something raw, something unguarded flickered in his expression. And in that moment, Ava realized, maybe Damian Blackwood wasn't as unbreakable as he seemed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ava wasn't sure what to do, what to say. Damian Blackwood was always composed, always in control. But tonight, he looked different. Weaker. Human. Damian, she said softly. His hands flexed against the counter, his grip so tight his knuckles turned white. The muscles in his jaw ticked. I said go back to bed. The coldness in his voice should have made her leave. It was a warning, a reminder that whatever was happening here, whatever this was, he didn't want her to see it. But instead of listening, she took another step closer. I'm not going anywhere. His head snapped toward her, gray eyes sharp, stormy. Ava. You don't have to tell me what's wrong, she cut in. But I'm not leaving you like this. His body tensed like he was bracing for battle. For a moment, she thought he'd push her away, tell her she was overstepping. But then, something shifted in his expression. Something almost tired. Ava reached out hesitantly and placed a hand over his. He stiffened, but didn't pull away. His skin was warm beneath her touch, the tension in his body so sharp she could feel it vibrating through him. She didn't know how long they stood there, the storm raging outside, the silence between them stretching like a fragile thread. Then, go back to bed, Ava, he said again, but this time his voice was quieter. Less of a demand. More of a plea. She searched his face, trying to understand. Trying to see past the walls he had so carefully built. But in the end, she nodded. Okay, she whispered. She let go of his hand and walked away, even though every part of her wanted to stay. And for the first time since their marriage began, she wondered if she was falling into something she might never escape. After that night, something changed between them. Damian was still distant, still cold. But there were moments, fleeting, almost imperceptible, where his mask slipped. Like the time she caught him watching her over breakfast, his gaze lingering just a second too long before he looked away. Or the time she tripped on the stairs, and before she could hit the ground, he was there, his hands gripping her waist, steadying her. Their eyes had met, and for a moment, neither of them moved. You should be more careful, he had murmured. But his hands hadn't let go right away. Then there were the nights when she couldn't sleep, when she wandered the house, lost in thoughts she didn't want to have. And sometimes, just sometimes, she would find him awake too, sitting in his study with a glass of whiskey, staring out at the city like he was searching for something he'd never find. She never asked what haunted him, and he never told her. But the distance between them was shrinking, whether he wanted it to or not. It wasn't until another man entered the picture that everything truly shifted. Ava had been invited to a charity function, one of the many social obligations that came with being Mrs. Blackwood. She had expected Damian to accompany her, but at the last minute, he had sent a message. Damian, something came up. Handle it. Annoyed but not surprised, she had gone alone. Which was how she ended up seated next to Liam Carter, a charming entrepreneur with a smile that could melt glaciers. You know, Liam mused as he swirled his drink, I always imagined Damian Blackwood's wife to be colder. Ava raised a brow. Cold how? You know, like him. Liam grinned. But you actually seem alive. She laughed. Should I take that as a compliment? Definitely. He leaned in slightly. Tell me, Ava, how does a woman like you end up with a man like him? She hesitated, unsure how to answer. It's complicated, I'll bet. Liam's gaze lingered on her. If you ever get tired of complicated, let me know. Before she could respond, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Ava turned and found Damian standing just a few feet away, watching them. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those stormy gray eyes, were locked on Liam with something dangerously close to fury. Ava swallowed. Damian was never emotional. never reactive. But in that moment she realized he didn't like seeing her with another man. The ride home was silent. Damian's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his jaw clenched. Ava folded her arms, watching him. "Are you going to say something?" He didn't answer. "Damian." "Nothing," she huffed. "You can't just show up, act all possessive, and then ignore me." His fingers flexed around the wheel. "I wasn't being possessive." She let out a sharp laugh.
"Right.
"So you just happened to show up and glare at Liam like you wanted to rip his head off." His jaw ticked. He was too close. Ava's heart pounded. "You don't care, remember?" Silence. "You were the one who made the rules, Damian," she pressed. 1 year. No emotions. No expectations. His knuckles turned white. "I know what I said." "Then why are you acting like this?" His hands tightened around the wheel. "Because you're mine." The words sent a shiver down her spine. She stared at him, her breath caught in her throat. "You don't even want me," she whispered. His eyes flicked to hers, dark and unreadable. "That's where you're wrong." Her pulse pounded. "Then prove it." The car screeched to a halt in front of the mansion. And, before she could process what was happening, Damian was leaning in. His hand cupped her jaw, his thumb grazing her skin. And then, his lips crashed against hers. The moment Damian's lips touched hers, Ava's world tilted. She had expected the kiss to be cold, controlled. But it wasn't. It was fierce, demanding, like he was unraveling right in front of her. Her fingers curled into his shirt as his hand slid into her hair, pulling her closer. She could feel the restraint in his grip, the war raging inside him. This wasn't part of the deal. They weren't supposed to feel. But she felt everything. When he finally pulled away, his breath was ragged, his forehead resting against hers. "This isn't just business anymore," he murmured. Ava's heart pounded. "Then what is it?" A long silence stretched between them. Then, "I don't know," he admitted. And that terrified her more than anything. Chapter 15. Falling Too Deep. After that night, nothing was the same. Damian didn't pull away anymore. He was still distant, still guarded, but there were moments where the walls cracked. Like the way his fingers lingered on her waist when they danced at a gala. Or the way he pulled her clothes at night, as if holding on to something he wasn't ready to lose. Ava knew she was falling. And she also knew it would end in heartbreak. Because Damian Blackwood didn't believe in love. And she wasn't sure she could survive being the woman who tried to change that. 1 year. That was the deal. Ava stared at the papers in front of her. The divorce agreement. It was time to walk away. She had told herself she wouldn't expect anything more. That she wouldn't hope. But a part of her had. A part of her had believed that maybe, just maybe, Damian would ask her to stay. But he hadn't. And she refused to beg. She packed her bags, her hands trembling as she placed the wedding ring on the dresser. She had given him everything. And in return, he had given her nothing. So she walked away. Damian came home to silence. His chest felt strangely hollow as he stepped into their bedroom, only to find it empty. Ava's clothes were gone. Her scent lingered in the air, but she was gone. His gaze dropped to the dresser. The ring sat there, mocking him. A sharp pain stabbed through his chest. She had left. And he had let her. Damian Blackwood had spent his whole life believing love was a weakness. But as he stood in that empty room, he realized losing Ava was the greatest weakness of all. 3 months. That's how long it had been since she walked away. Ava had rebuilt her life. She had a new job, a new apartment. She told herself she was fine. But some nights, she still dreamed of him. Of his touch. Of the way he had looked at her. Even when he refused to admit the truth. Then one night, there was a knock at her door. As she opened it, and there he was. Damian Blackwood. Looking like a man who had lost everything. Her breath caught. "What are you doing here?" His jaw clenched. "I made a mistake." Her heart pounded. "Damian." "I let you go," he cut in, his voice rough. "I shouldn't have." Her lips parted, but no words came out. "I love you, Ava," he said. The words sounded foreign, like he had never said them before. Maybe he hadn't. but the raw desperation in his voice told her he meant them. Ava swallowed, her chest tightening. She had spent months convincing herself that he didn't care. But now, here he was, breaking all his rules for her. Tears burned her eyes. "It's too late, Damian." His hand reached for hers, his fingers trembling. "Then I'll spend the rest of my life proving that it's not." And for the first time since they met, she believed him. 1 year later, Ava stood in front of the mirror, smoothing down the lace of her wedding dress. A strong pair of arms wrapped around her waist. "You look beautiful," Damian murmured, pressing a kiss to her shoulder. She smiled. "I thought you didn't believe in love." His grip tightened. "I believe in you." She turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had once been nothing more than a contract. Now he was everything. Damian Blackwood had spent his life thinking love was a weakness. But in the end, Ava had taught him that love was the strongest thing of all. And this time, he would never let her go.